Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Plato's Republic, Book 2. When I said this, I thought I had done with the discussion. But it turned out to have been only a prelude. Glaucon showed his characteristic courage on this occasion too, and refused to accept Thrasymachus' abandonment of the argument. "Socrates," he said, "do you want to seem to have persuaded us that it is better in every way to be just than unjust? Or do you want truly to convince us of this?" "I want truly to convince you," I said, "if I can." "Well, then, you certainly aren't doing what you want. Tell me, do you think there is a kind of good we welcome, not because we desire what comes from it, but because we welcome it for its own sake? Joy, for example, and all the harmless pleasures that have no results beyond the joy of having them. Certainly I think there are such things. And is there a kind of good we like for its own sake, and also for the sake of what comes from it? Knowing, for example, and seeing, and being healthy. We welcome such things, I suppose, on both counts. Yes. And do you also see a third kind of good, such as physical training, medical treatment when sick, medicine itself, and other ways of making money? We'd say that these are onerous, but beneficial to us, and we wouldn't choose them for their own sakes, but for the sake of the rewards and other things that come from them. There is also this third kind, but what of it? Where do you put justice? I myself put it among the finest goods, as something to be valued by anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness, both because of itself and because of what comes from it. That isn't most people's opinion. They'd say that justice belongs to the onerous kind, and is to be practiced for the sake of the rewards and popularity that comes from a reputation for justice, but is to be avoided because of itself as something burdensome. I know that's the general opinion. Thrasymachus faulted justice on these grounds a moment ago and praised injustice, but it seems that I'm a slow learner. Come then, and listen to me as well, and see whether you still have that problem, for I think that Thrasymachus gave up before he had to, charmed by you as if he were a snake. But I'm not yet satisfied by the argument on either side. I want to know what justice and injustice are, and what power each itself has when it's by itself in the soul. I want to leave out of account their rewards and what comes from each of them. So, if you agree, I'll renew the argument of Thrasymachus. First, I'll state what kind of thing people consider justice to be, and what its origins are. Second, I'll argue that all who practice it do so unwillingly, as something necessary, not as something good. Third, I'll argue that they have good reason to act as they do, for the life of an unjust person is, they say, much better than that of a just one. It isn't, Socrates, that I believe any of that myself. I'm perplexed indeed, and my ears are deafened, listening to Thrasymachus and countless others. But I've yet to hear anyone defend justice in the way I want, proving that it is better than injustice. I want to hear it praised by itself, and I think that I'm most likely to hear this from you. Therefore, I'm going to speak at length in praise of the unjust life, and in doing so, I'll show you the way I want to hear you praising justice and denouncing injustice. But see whether you want me to do that or not. I want that most of all. Indeed, what subject could someone with any understanding enjoy discussing more often? Excellent. Then let's discuss the first subject I mentioned, what justice is and what its origins are. They say that to do injustice is naturally good, and to suffer injustice bad, but that the badness of suffering it so far exceeds the goodness of doing it, that those who have done and suffered injustice and tasted both, but who lack the power to do it and avoid suffering it, decide that it is profitable to come to an agreement with each other, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. As a result, they begin to make laws and covenants, and what the law commands they call lawful and just. This, they say, is the origin and essence of justice. It is intermediate between the best and the worst. The best is to do injustice without paying the penalty. The worst is to suffer it without being able to take revenge. Justice is a mean between these two extremes. People value it not as a good, but because they are too weak to do injustice with impunity. Someone who has the power to do this, however, and is a true man, wouldn't make an agreement with anyone not to do injustice in order not to suffer it. For him, that would be madness. This is the nature of justice, according to the argument, Socrates, and these are its natural origins. We can see most clearly that those who practice justice do it unwillingly, and because they lack the power to do injustice, if, in our thoughts, we grant to a just and an unjust person the freedom to do whatever they like. We can then follow both of them and see where their desires would lead. And will catch the just person red-handed traveling the same road as the unjust. The reason for this is the desire to outdo others and get more and more. This is what anyone's nature naturally pursues as good. But nature is forced by law into the perversion of treating fairness with respect. The freedom I mentioned would be most easily realized if both people had the power they say the ancestor of Gyges of Lydia possessed. The story goes that he was a shepherd in the service of the ruler of Lydia. There was a violent thunderstorm, and an earthquake broke open the ground and created a chasm at the place where he was tending his sheep. Seeing this, he was filled with amazement and went down into it. And there, in addition to many other wonders of which we are told, he saw a hollow bronze horse. There were window-like openings in it, and peeping in, he saw a corpse, which seemed to be of more than human size, wearing nothing but a gold ring on its finger. He took the ring and came out of the chasm. He wore the ring at the usual monthly meeting that reported to the king on the state of the flocks. And as he was sitting among the others, he happened to turn the setting of the ring towards himself to the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting near him, and they went on talking as if he had gone. He wondered at this, and, fingering the ring, he turned the setting outward again and became visible. So he experimented with the ring to test whether it indeed had this power. And it did. If he turned the setting inward, he became invisible. If he turned it outward, he became visible again. When he realized this, he at once arranged to become one of the messengers sent to report to the king. And when he arrived there, he seduced the king's wife, attacked the king with her help, killed him, and took over the kingdom. Let's suppose, then, that there were two such rings, one worn by a just and the other by an unjust person. Now, no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice or stay away from other people's property when he could take whatever he wanted from the marketplace with impunity, go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all the other things that would make him like a god among humans. Rather, his actions would be in no way different from those of an unjust person, and both would follow the same path. This, some would say, is a great proof that one is never just willingly, but only when compelled to be. No one believes justice to be a good when it is kept private, since, wherever either person thinks he can do injustice with impunity, he does it. Indeed, every man believes that injustice is far more profitable to himself than justice. And any exponent of this argument will say he's right. For someone who didn't want to do injustice, given this sort of opportunity, and who didn't touch other people's property, would be thought wretched and stupid by everyone aware of the situation, though, of course, they'd praise him in public, deceiving each other for fear of suffering injustice. So much for my second topic. As for the choice between the lives we're discussing, we'll be able to make a correct judgment about that only if we separate the most just and the most unjust. Otherwise, we won't be able to do it. Here's the separation I have in mind. We'll subtract nothing from the injustice of an unjust person, and nothing from the justice of a just one, but we'll take each to be complete in his own way of life. First, therefore, we must suppose that an unjust person will act as clever craftsmen do. A first-rate captain or doctor, for example, knows the difference between what his craft can and can't do. He attempts the first, but lets the second go by, and if he happens to slip, he can put things right. In the same way, an unjust person's successful attempts at injustice must remain undetected if he is to be fully unjust. Anyone who is caught should be thought inept, for the extreme of injustice is to be believed to be just without being just. And our completely unjust person must be given complete injustice. Nothing may be subtracted from it. We must allow that while doing the greatest injustice, he has nonetheless provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. If he happens to make a slip, he must be able to put it right. If any of his unjust activities should be discovered, he must be able to speak persuasively, or to use force. And if force is needed, he must have the help of courage and strength, and of the substantial wealth and friends with which he has provided himself. Having hypothesized such a person, let's now, in our argument, put beside him a just man, who is simple and noble, and who, as Aeschylus says, doesn't want to be believed to be good, but to be so. We must take away his reputation, for a reputation for justice would bring him honor and rewards, so that it wouldn't be clear whether he is just for the sake of justice itself, or for the sake of those honors and rewards. We must strip him of everything except justice, and make his situation the opposite of an unjust person's. Though he does know injustice, he must have the greatest reputation for it, so that his justice may be tested full strength, and not diluted by wrongdoing and what comes from it. Let him stay like that, unchanged until he dies, just, but all his life believed to be unjust. In this way, both will reach the extremes, the one of justice and the other of injustice, and we'll be able to judge which of them is happier. "Whew, Glaucon," I said. "How vigorously you've scoured each of the men for our competition, just as you would a pair of statues for an art competition." "I do the best I can," he replied. "Since the two are as I've described, in any case, it shouldn't be difficult to complete the account of the kind of life that awaits each of them, but it must be done. And if what I say sounds crude, Socrates, remember that it isn't I who speak, but those who praise injustice at the expense of justice. They'll say that a just person in such circumstances will be whipped, stretched on a rack, chained, blinded with fire, and, at the end, when he has suffered every kind of evil, he'll be impaled, and will realize then that one shouldn't want to be just, but to be believed to be just. Indeed, Aeschylus's words are far more correctly applied to unjust people than to just ones. For the supporters of injustice will say that a really unjust person, having a way of life based on the truth about things and not living in accordance with opinion, doesn't want simply to be believed to be unjust, but actually to be so. Harvesting a deep furrow in his mind where wise counsels propagate. He rules his city because of his reputation for justice. He marries into any family he wishes. He gives his children in marriage to anyone he wishes. He has contracts and partnerships with anyone he wants. And besides benefiting himself in all these ways, he profits because he has no scruples about doing injustice. In any contest, public or private, he's the winner and outdoes his enemies. And by outdoing them, he becomes wealthy, benefiting his friends and harming his enemies. He makes adequate sacrifices to the gods and sets up magnificent offerings to them. He takes better care of the gods, therefore, and indeed of the human beings he's fond of, than a just person does. Hence it's likely that the gods in turn will take better care of him than of a just person. That's what they say, Socrates, that gods and humans provide a better life for unjust people than for just ones. When Glaucon had said this, I had it in mind to respond, but his brother Adeimantus intervened. "You surely don't think the position has been adequately stated?" "Why not?" I said. "The most important thing to say hasn't been said yet." "Well, then," I replied, "a man's brother must stand by him, as the saying goes. If Glaucon has omitted anything, you must help him. Yet what he has said is enough to throw me to the canvas, and make me unable to come to the aid of justice." 'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Nonsense, he said. Hear what more I have to say, for we should also fully explore the arguments that are opposed to the ones Glaucon gave, the ones that praise justice and find fault with injustice, so that what I take to be his intention may be clearer. When fathers speak to their sons, they say that one must be just, as do all the others who have charge of anyone. But they don't praise justice itself, only the high reputations it leads to and the consequences of being thought to be just, such as the public offices, marriages, and other things Glaucon listed. But they elaborate even further on the consequences of reputation. By bringing in the esteem of the gods, they are able to talk about the abundant good things that they themselves and the noble Hesiod and Homer say that the gods have given to the pious. For Hesiod says that the gods make the oak trees bear acorns at the top and bees in the middle, and make fleecy sheep heavy laden with wool for the just, and tells of many other good things akin to these. And Homer is similar. Quote, "When a good king in his piety upholds justice, the black earth bears wheat and barley for him, and his trees are heavy with fruit. His sheep bear lambs unfailingly, and the sea yields up its fish." Musaeus and his sons make the gods give the just more headstrong goods than these. In their stories, they lead the just to Hades, seat them on couches, provide them with a symposium of pious people, crown them with wreaths, and make them spend all their time drinking, as if they thought drunkenness was the finest wage of virtue. Others stretch even further the wages that virtue receives from the gods, for they say that someone who is pious and keeps his promises leaves his children's children and a whole race behind him. In these and other similar ways they praise justice. They bury the impious and unjust in mud in Hades, force them to carry water in a sieve, bring them into bad repute while they're still alive, and all those penalties that Glaucon gave to the just person they give to the unjust. But they have nothing else to say. This, then, is the way people praise justice and find fault with injustice. Besides this, Socrates, consider another form of argument about justice and injustice employed both by private individuals and by poets. All go on repeating with one voice that justice and moderation are fine things, but hard and onerous, while licentiousness and injustice are sweet and easy to acquire, and are shameful only in opinion and law. They add that unjust deeds are for the most part more profitable than just ones, and, whether in public or private, they willingly honor vicious people who have wealth and other types of power and declare them to be happy. But they dishonor and disregard the weak and the poor, even though they agree that they are better than the others. But the most wonderful of all these arguments concerns what they have to say about the gods and virtue. They say that the gods, too, assign misfortune and a bad life to many good people, and the opposite fate to their opposites. Begging priests and prophets frequent the doors of the rich, and persuade them that they possess a God-given power founded on sacrifices and incantations. If the rich person, or any of his ancestors, has committed an injustice, they can fix it with pleasant rituals. Moreover, if he wishes to injure some enemy, then, at little expense, he'll be able to harm just and unjust alike, for by means of spells and enchantments they can persuade the gods to serve them. And the poets are brought forward as witnesses to all these accounts. Some harp on the ease of vice as follows, quote, Vice in abundance is easy to get. The road is smooth and begins beside you. But the gods have put sweat between us and virtue. End quote. And a road that is long, rough, and steep. Others quote Homer to bear witness that the gods can be influenced by humans, since he said, "The gods themselves can be swayed by prayer, and with sacrifices and soothing promises, incense and libations, human beings turn them from their purpose when someone has transgressed and sinned." End quote. And they present a noisy throng of books by Musaeus and Orpheus, offspring, as they say, of Selene and the Muses, in accordance with which they perform their rituals. And they persuade not only individuals but whole cities that the unjust deeds of the living or the dead can be absolved or purified through sacrifices and pleasant games, whether those who have committed them are still alive or have died. These initiations, as they call them, free people from punishment hereafter, while a terrible fate awaits those who have not performed rituals. When all such sayings about the attitudes of gods and humans to virtue and vice are so often repeated, Socrates, what effect do you suppose they have on the souls of young people? I mean those who are clever, and are able to flit from one of these sayings to another, so to speak, and gather from them an impression of what sort of person he should be, and of how best to travel the road of life. He would surely ask himself Pindar's question, "Should I by justice or by crooked deceit scale this high wall, and live my life guarded and secure?" And he'll answer, "The various sayings suggest that there is no advantage in my being just if I'm not also thought just, while the troubles and penalties of being just are apparent. But they tell me that an unjust person, who has secured for himself a reputation for justice, lives the life of a god. Since, then, opinion forcibly overcomes truth, and controls happiness, as the wise men say, I must surely turn entirely to it. I should create a facade of illusory virtue around me to deceive those who come near, but keep behind it the greedy and crafty fox of the wise Archilochus. But surely, someone will object, it isn't easy for vice to remain always hidden. We'll reply that nothing great is easy. And in any case, if we're to be happy, we must follow the path indicated in these accounts. To remain undiscovered, we'll form secret societies and political clubs. And there are teachers of persuasion to make us clever in dealing with assemblies and law courts. Therefore, using persuasion in one place and force in another, we'll outdo others without paying a penalty. What about the gods? Surely we can't hide from them or use violent force against them. Well, if the gods don't exist or don't concern themselves with human affairs, why should we worry at all about hiding from them? If they do exist and do concern themselves with us, we've learned all we know about them from the laws and the poets who give their genealogies. Nowhere else. But these are the very people who tell us that the gods can be persuaded and influenced by sacrifices, gentle prayers, and offerings. Hence, we should believe them on both matters or neither. If we believe them, we should be unjust and offer sacrifices from the fruits of our injustice. If we are just, our only gain is not to be punished by the gods, since we lose the profits of injustice. But if we are unjust, we get the profits of our crimes and transgressions, and afterwards persuade the gods by prayer and escape without punishment. But in Hades, won't we pay the penalty for crimes committed here, either ourselves or our children's children? My friend, the young man will say as he does his calculation, mystery rites have great power, and the gods have great power of absolution. The greatest cities tell us this, as do those children of the gods who have become poets and prophets. Why, then, should we still choose justice over the greatest injustice? Many eminent authorities agree that if we practice such injustice with a false facade, we'll do well at the hands of gods and humans, living and dying as we've a mind to. So, given all that has been said, Socrates, how is it possible for anyone of any power, whether of mind, wealth, body, or birth, to be willing to honor justice and not laugh aloud when he hears it praised? Indeed, if anyone can show that what we've said is false and has adequate knowledge that justice is best, he'll surely be full not of anger, but of forgiveness for the unjust. He knows that, apart from someone of godlike character who is disgusted by injustice, or one who has gained knowledge and avoids injustice for that reason, no one is just willingly. Through cowardice or old age or some other weakness, people do indeed object to injustice. But it's obvious that they do so only because they lack the power to do injustice. For the first of them to acquire it is the first to do as much injustice as he can. And all of this has no other cause than the one that led Glaucon and me to say to you, Socrates, of all you who claim to praise justice, from the original heroes of old whose words survive to the men of the present day, not one has ever blamed injustice or praised justice except by mentioning the reputations, honors, and rewards that are their consequences. No one has ever adequately described what each itself does of its own power by its presence in the soul of the person who possesses it, even if it remains hidden from gods and humans. No one, whether in poetry or in private conversations, has adequately argued that injustice is the worst thing a soul can have in it, and that justice is the greatest good. If you had treated the subject in this way and persuaded us from youth, we wouldn't now be guarding against one another's injustices, but each would be his own best guardian, afraid that by doing injustice he'd be living with the worst thing possible. Thrasymachus, or anyone else, might say what we've said, Socrates, or maybe even more, in discussing justice and injustice, crudely inverting their powers, in my opinion. And frankly, it's because I want to hear the opposite from you that I speak with all the force I can muster. So don't merely give us a theoretical argument that justice is stronger than injustice, but tell us what each itself does, because of its own powers, to someone who possesses it, that makes injustice bad and justice good. Follow Glaucon's advice, and don't take reputations into account. For if you don't deprive justice and injustice of their true reputations and attach false ones to them, we'll say that you are not praising them, but their reputations, and that you're encouraging us to be unjust in secret. In that case, we'll say that you agree with Thrasymachus, that justice is the good of another, the advantage of the stronger, while injustice is one's own advantage and profit, though not the advantage of the weaker. You agree that justice is one of the greatest goods, the ones that are worth getting for the sake of what comes from them, but much more so for their own sake, such as seeing, hearing, knowing, being healthy, and all other goods that are fruitful by their own nature and not simply because of reputation. Therefore, praise justice as a good of that kind, explaining how, because of its very self, it benefits its possessors, and how injustice harms them. Leave wages and reputations for others to praise. Others would satisfy me if they've praised justice and blamed injustice in that way, extolling the wages of one and denigrating those of the other. But you, unless you order me to be satisfied, wouldn't. For you've spent your whole life investigating this and nothing else. Don't, then, give us only a theoretical argument that justice is stronger than injustice, but show what effect each has because of itself on the person who has it, the one for good and the other for bad, whether it remains hidden from gods and human beings or not. While I'd always admired the natures of Glaucon and Adeimantus, I was especially pleased on this occasion, and I said, "You are the sons of a great man." And Glaucon's lover began his elegy well when he wrote, celebrating your achievements at the Battle of Megara, quote, "Sons of Ariston, godlike offspring of a famous man." End quote. That's well said, in my opinion, for you must indeed be affected by the divine if you're not convinced that injustice is better than justice, and yet can speak on its behalf as you have done. And I believe that you really are unconvinced by your own words. I infer this from the way you live. For if I had only your words to go on, I wouldn't trust you. The more I trust you, however, the more I am at a loss as to what to do. I don't see how I can be of help. Indeed, I believe I'm incapable of it. And here's my evidence. I thought what I said to Thrasymachus showed that justice is better than injustice, but you won't accept it from me. On the other hand, I don't see how I can refuse my help. For I fear that it may even be impious to have breath in one's body and the ability to speak, and yet to stand idly by and not defend justice when it is being prosecuted. So the best course is to give justice any assistance I can. 'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Glaucon and the others begged me not to abandon the argument, but to help in every way to track down what justice and injustice are, and what the truth about their benefits is. So I told them what I had in mind. The investigation we are undertaking is not an easy one, but requires keen eyesight. Therefore, since we aren't clever people, we should adopt the method of investigation that we'd use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance, and then noticed that the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. We consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to read the larger ones first, and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they really are the same. That's certainly true, said Adeimantus, but how is this case similar to our investigation of justice? I'll tell you. We say, don't we, that there is the justice of a single man and also the justice of a whole city? Certainly. And a city is larger than a single man. It is larger. Perhaps, then, there is more justice in the larger thing, and it will be easier to learn what it is. So, if you're willing, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city, and afterwards look for it in the individual, observing the ways in which the smaller is similar to the larger. That seems fine to me. If we could watch a city coming to be in theory, wouldn't we also see its justice coming to be, and its injustice as well? Probably so. And when that process is completed, we can hope to find what we are looking for more easily. Of course. Do you think we should try to carry it out, then? It's no small task in my view, so think it over. We have already, said Adeimantus. Don't even consider doing anything else. I think a city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient, but we all need many things. Do you think that a city is founded on any other principle? No. And because people need many things, and because one person calls on a second out of one need, and on a third out of a different need, many people gather in a single place to live together as partners and helpers. And such a settlement is called a city. Isn't that so? It is. And if they share things with one another, giving and taking, they do so because each believes that this is better for himself. That's right. Come then, let's create a city in theory from its beginnings. And it's our needs, it seems, that will create it. It is indeed. Surely our first and greatest need is to provide food to sustain life. Certainly. And our second is for shelter, and our third for clothes and such. That's right. How, then, will a city be able to provide all this? Won't one person have to be a farmer, another a builder, and another a weaver? And shouldn't we add a cobbler and someone else to provide medical care? All right. So the essential minimum for a city is 4 or 5 men? Apparently. And what about this? Must each of them contribute his own work for the common use of all? For example, will a farmer provide food for everyone, spending quadruple the time and labor to provide food to be shared by them all? Or will he not bother about that, producing 1/4 of the food in 1/4 of the time and spending the other 3/4 one in building a house, one in the production of clothes, and one in making shoes, not troubling to associate with the others, but minding his own business on his own. Perhaps, Socrates, Adeimantus replied, the way you suggested first would be easier than the other. That certainly wouldn't be surprising, for even as you were speaking, it occurred to me that, in the first place, we aren't all born alike, but each of us differs somewhat in nature from the others, one being suited to one task, another to another. Or don't you think so? I do. Second, does one person do a better job if he practices many crafts? Or, since he's one person himself, if he practices one? It's clear at any rate, I think, that if one misses the right moment in anything, the work is spoiled. It is. That's because the thing to be done won't wait on the leisure of the doer, but the doer must of necessity pay close attention to his work, rather than treating it as a secondary occupation. Yes, he must. The result, then, is that more plentiful and better quality goods are more easily produced if each person does one thing for which he is naturally suited, does it at the right time, and is released from having to do any of the others. Absolutely. Then, Adeimantus, we're going to need more than 4 citizens to provide the things we've mentioned, for a farmer won't make his own plow, not if it's to be a good one, nor his hoe, nor any of his other farming tools. Neither will a builder, and he too needs lots of things. And the same is true of a weaver and a cobbler, isn't it? It is. Hence, carpenters, metal workers, and many other craftsmen of that sort will share our little city and make it bigger. That's right. Yet it won't be a huge settlement even if we add cowherds, shepherds, and other herdsmen in order that the farmers have cows to do their plowing, the builders have oxen to share with the farmers in hauling their materials, and the weavers and cobblers have hides and fleeces to use. It won't be a small one either if it has to hold all those. Moreover, it's almost impossible to establish a city in a place where nothing has to be imported. Indeed, it is. So we'll need yet further people to import from other cities whatever is needed. Yes. And if an importer goes empty-handed to another city, without a cargo of the things needed by the city from which he's to bring back what his own city needs, he'll come away empty-handed, won't he? So it seems. Therefore, our citizens must not only produce enough for themselves at home, but also goods of the right quality and quantity to satisfy the requirements of others. They must. So we'll need more farmers and other craftsmen in our city. Yes. And others to take care of imports and exports, and they're called merchants, aren't they? Yes. So we'll need merchants too. Certainly. And if the trade is by sea, we'll need a good many others who know how to sail. A good many indeed. And how will those in the city itself share the things that each produces? It was for the sake of this that we made their partnership and founded their city. Clearly, they must do it by buying and selling. Then we'll need a marketplace and a currency for such exchange. Certainly. If a farmer or other craftsman brings some of his products to market, and he doesn't arrive at the same time as those who want to exchange things with him, is he to sit idly in the marketplace, away from his own work? Not at all. There will be people who will notice this and provide the requisite service. In well-organized cities, they'll usually be those whose bodies are weakest and who aren't fit to do any other work. They'll stay around the market exchanging money for the goods of those who have something to sell, and then exchanging those goods for the money of those who want them. Then to fill this need, there will have to be retailers in our city. For aren't those who establish themselves in the marketplace to provide this service of buying and selling called retailers, while those who travel between cities are called merchants? That's right. There are other servants, I think, whose minds alone wouldn't qualify them for membership in our society, but whose bodies are strong enough for labor. These sell the use of their strength for a price called a wage, and hence are themselves called wage earners. Isn't that so? Certainly. So wage earners complete our city? I think so. Well, Adeimantus, has our city grown to completeness then? Perhaps it has. Then where are justice and injustice to be found in it? With which of the things we examined did they come in? I've no idea, Socrates, unless it was somewhere in some need that these people have of one another. You may be right, but we must look into it and not grow weary. First, then, let's see what sort of life our citizens will lead when they've been provided for in the way we've been describing. They'll produce bread, wine, clothes, and shoes, won't they? They'll build houses, work naked and barefoot in the summer, and wear adequate clothing and shoes in the winter. For food, they'll knead and cook the flour and meal they've made from wheat and barley. They'll put their honest cakes and loaves on reeds or clean leaves, and, reclining on beds strewn with yew and myrtle, they'll feast with their children, drink their wine, and, crowned with wreaths, hymn the gods. They'll enjoy sex with one another, but bear no more children than their resources allow, lest they fall into either poverty or war. It seems that you make your people feast without any delicacies, Glaucon interrupted. True enough, I said. I was forgetting that they'll obviously need salt, olives, cheese, boiled roots, and vegetables of the sort they cook in the country. We'll give them desserts, too, of course, consisting of figs, chickpeas, and beans, and they'll roast myrtle and acorns before the fire, drinking moderately. And so they'll live in peace and good health, and when they die at a ripe old age, they'll bequeath a similar life to their children. If you were founding a city for pigs, Socrates, he replied, wouldn't you fatten them on the same diet? Then how should I feed these people, Glaucon? I asked. In the conventional way. If they are to suffer hardship, they should recline on proper couches, dine at a table, and have the delicacies and desserts that people have nowadays. All right, I understand. It isn't merely the origin of a city that we're considering, it seems, but the origin of a luxurious city. And that may not be a bad idea, for by examining it, we might very well see how justice and injustice grow up in cities. Yet the true city, in my opinion, is the one we've described, the healthy one, as it were. But let's study a city with a fever if that's what you want. There's nothing to stop us. The things I mentioned earlier and the way of life I described won't satisfy some people, it seems, but couches, tables, and other furniture will have to be added. And, of course, all sorts of delicacies, perfumed oils, incense, prostitutes, and pastries. We mustn't provide them only with the necessities we mentioned at first, such as houses, clothes, and shoes, but painting and embroidery must be begun, and gold, ivory, and the like acquired. Isn't that so? Yes. Then we must enlarge our city, for the healthy one is no longer adequate. We must increase it in size and fill it with a multitude of things that go beyond what is necessary for a city. Hunters, for example, and artists or imitators, many of whom work with shapes and colors, many with music. And there will be poets and their assistants, actors, choral dancers, contractors, and makers of all kinds of devices, including, among other things, those needed for the adornment of women. And so we'll need more servants, too. Or don't you think that we'll need tutors, wet nurses, nannies, beauticians, barbers, chefs, cooks, and swineherds? We didn't need any of these things in our earlier city, but we'll need them in this one. And we'll also need many more cattle, won't we, if the people are going to eat meat? Of course. And if we live like that, we'll have a far greater need for doctors than we did before. Much greater. And the land, I suppose, that used to be adequate to feed the population we had then, will cease to be adequate and become too small. What do you think? The same. Then we'll have to seize some of our neighbors' land if we're to have enough pasture and plow land. And won't our neighbors want to seize part of ours as well, if they too have surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limit of their necessities? That's completely inevitable, Socrates. Then our next step will be war, Glaucon, won't it? It will. We won't say yet whether the effects of war are good or bad, but only that we've now found the origins of war. It comes from those same desires that are most of all responsible for the bad things that happen to cities and the individuals in them. That's right. Then the city must be further enlarged, and not just by a small number either, but by a whole army, which will do battle with the invaders in defense of the city's substantial wealth and all the other things we mentioned. Why aren't the citizens themselves adequate for that purpose? They won't be, if the agreement you and the rest of us made when we were founding the city was a good one. For surely we agreed, if you remember, that it's impossible for a single person to practice many crafts or professions well. That's true. Well then, don't you think that warfare is a profession? Of course. Then should we be more concerned about cobbling than about warfare? Not at all. But we prevented a cobbler from trying to be a farmer, weaver, or builder at the same time, and said that he must remain a cobbler in order to produce fine work. And each of the others, too, was to work all his life at a single trade for which he had a natural aptitude, and keep away from all the others, so as not to miss the right moment to practice his own work well. Now, isn't it of the greatest importance that warfare be practiced well? And is fighting a war so easy that a farmer, or a cobbler, or any other craftsman can be a soldier at the same time? Though no one can become so much as a good player of checkers or dice if he considers it only as a sideline and doesn't practice it from childhood. Or can someone pick up a shield or any other weapon or tool of war and immediately perform adequately in an infantry battle or any other kind? No other tool makes anyone who picks it up a craftsman or champion unless he has acquired the requisite knowledge and has had sufficient practice. If tools could make anyone who picked them up an expert, they'd be valuable indeed. Then, to the degree that the work of the guardians is most important, it requires most freedom from other things and the greatest skill and devotion. I should think so. And doesn't it also require a person whose nature is suited to that way of life? Certainly. Then our job, it seems, is to select, if we can, the kind of nature suited to guard the city. It is. By God, it's no trivial task that we've taken on, but insofar as we are able, we mustn't shrink from it. No, we mustn't. Do you think that, when it comes to guarding, there is any difference between the nature of a pedigree young dog and that of a well-born youth? What do you mean? Well, each needs keen senses, speed to catch what it sees, and strength in case it has to fight it out with what it captures. They both need all these things. And each must be courageous, if indeed he's to fight well. Course. And will a horse, a dog, or any other animal be courageous if he isn't spirited? Or haven't you noticed just how invincible and unbeatable spirit is? So that its presence makes the whole soul fearless and unconquerable. I have noticed that. The physical qualities of the guardians are clear, then. Yes. And as far as their souls are concerned, they must be spirited. That too. But if they have natures like that, Glaucon, won't they be savage to each other and to the rest of the citizens? By God, it will be hard for them to be anything else. Yet surely they must be gentle to their own people and harsh to the enemy. If they aren't, they won't wait around for others to destroy the city, but will do it themselves first. That's true. What are we to do then? Where are we to find a character that is both gentle and high-spirited at the same time? After all, a gentle nature is the opposite of a spirited one. Apparently. If someone lacks either gentleness or spirit, he can't be a good guardian, yet it seems impossible to combine them. It follows that a good guardian cannot exist. It looks like it. I couldn't see a way out, but on re-examining what had gone before, I said, we deserve to be stuck, for we've lost sight of the analogy we put forward. How do you mean? We overlook the fact that there are natures of the sort we thought impossible, natures in which these opposites are indeed combined. Where? You can see them in other animals too, but especially in the one to which we compared the guardian. For you know, of course, that a pedigree dog naturally has a character of this sort. He is gentle as can be to those he's used to and knows, but the opposite to those he doesn't know. I do know that. So the combination we want is possible after all, and our search for the good guardian is not contrary to nature. Apparently not. Then do you think that our future guardian, besides being spirited, must also be by nature philosophical? How do you mean? I don't understand. It's something else you see in dogs, and it makes you wonder at the animal. What? When a dog sees someone it doesn't know, it gets angry before anything bad happens to it. But when it knows someone, it welcomes him, even if it has never received anything good from him. Haven't you ever wondered at that? I've never paid attention to it, but obviously that is the way a dog behaves. Surely this is a refined quality in its nature, and one that is truly philosophical. In what way philosophical? Because it judges anything it sees to be either a friend or an enemy, on no other basis than that it knows the one and doesn't know the other. And how could it be anything besides a lover of learning, if it defines what is its own and what is alien to it in terms of knowledge and ignorance? It couldn't. But surely the love of learning is the same thing as philosophy or the love of wisdom. It is. Then may we confidently assume, in the case of a human being too, that if he is to be gentle toward his own and those he knows, he must be a lover of learning and wisdom. We may. Philosophy, spirit, Speed and strength must all then be combined in the nature of anyone who is to be a fine and good guardian of our city. Absolutely. 'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning, we come round right. Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Then those are the traits a potential guardian would need at the outset. But how are we to bring him up and educate him? Will inquiry into that topic bring us any closer to the goal of our inquiry, which is to discover the origins of justice and injustice in a city? We want our account to be adequate, but we don't want it to be any longer than necessary. I certainly expect, Glaucon's brother said, that such inquiry will further our goal. Then, by God, Adeimantus, I said, we mustn't leave it out, even if it turns out to be a somewhat lengthy affair. No, we mustn't. Come then, and just as if we had the leisure to make up stories, let's describe in theory how to educate our men. All right. What will their education be? Or is it hard to find anything better than that which has developed over a long period? Physical training for the bodies and music and poetry for the soul. Yes, it would be hard. Now, we start education in music and poetry before physical training, don't we? Of course. Do you include stories under music and poetry? I do. Aren't there two kinds of story, one true and the other false? Yes. And mustn't our men be educated in both, but first in false ones? I don't understand what you mean. Don't you understand that we first tell stories to children? These are false, on the whole, though they have some truth in them, and we tell them to small children before physical training begins. That's true. And that's what I meant by saying that we must deal with music and poetry before physical training. All right. You know, don't you, that the beginning of any process is most important, especially for anything young and tender. It's at that time that it is most malleable and takes on any pattern one wishes to impress on it. Exactly. Then shall we carelessly allow the children to hear any old stories, told by just anyone, and to take beliefs into their souls that are for the most part opposite to the ones we think they should hold when they are grown up? We certainly won't. Then we must first of all, it seems, supervise the storytellers. We'll select their stories whenever they are fine or beautiful, and reject them when they aren't. And we'll persuade nurses and mothers to tell their children the ones we have selected, since they will shape their children's souls with stories, much more than they shape their bodies by handling them. Many of the stories they tell now, however, must be thrown out. Which ones do you mean? We'll first look at the major stories, and by seeing how to deal with them, we'll see how to deal with the minor ones as well, for they exhibit the same pattern and have the same effects whether they're famous or not. Don't you think so? I do, but I don't know which ones you're calling major. Those that Homer, Hesiod, and other poets tell us, for surely they composed false stories, told them to people, and are still telling them. Which stories do you mean, and what fault do you find in them? The fault one ought to find first and foremost, especially if the falsehood isn't well told. For example, when a story gives a bad image of what gods and heroes are like, the way a painter does whose picture is not at all like the things he's trying to paint. Well, you're right to object to that, but what sort of thing in particular do you have in mind? First, telling the greatest falsehood about the most important things doesn't make a fine story. I mean Hesiod, telling us about how Ouranos behaved, how Kronos punished him for it, and how he was in turn punished by his own son. But even if it were true, it should be passed over in silence, not told to foolish young people. And if, for some reason, it has to be told, only a very few people, pledged to secrecy, and after sacrificing not just a pig, but something great and scarce, should hear it, so that their number is kept as small as possible. Yes, such stories are hard to deal with, and they shouldn't be told in our city, Adeimantus. Nor should a young person hear it said that in committing the worst crimes he's doing nothing out of the ordinary, or that if he inflicts every kind of punishment on an unjust father, he's only doing the same as the first and greatest of the gods. No, by God, I don't think myself that these stories are fit to be told. Indeed, if we want the guardians of our city to think that it's shameful to be easily provoked into hating one another, we mustn't allow any stories about gods warring, fighting, or plotting against one another, for they aren't true. The battles of gods and giants, and all the various stories of the gods hating their families and friends, should neither be told nor even woven in embroideries. If we're to persuade our young people that no citizen has ever hated another, and that it's impious to do so, then that's what should be told to children from the beginning, by old men and women. And as these children grow older, poets should be compelled to tell them the same sort of thing. We won't admit stories into our city, whether allegorical or not, about Hera being chained by her son, nor about Hephaestus being hurled from heaven by his father when he tried to help his mother, who was being beaten, nor about the battle of the gods in Homer. The young can't distinguish what is allegorical from what isn't, and the opinions they absorb at that age are hard to erase and apt to become unalterable. For these reasons, then, we should probably take the utmost care to ensure that the first stories they hear about virtue are the best ones for them to hear. That's reasonable. But if someone asked us what stories these are, what should we say? You and I, Adeimantus, aren't poets, but we are founding a city, and it's appropriate for the sounders to know the patterns on which poets must base their stories, and from which they mustn't deviate. But we aren't actually going to compose their poems for them. All right, but what precisely are the patterns for theology or stories about the gods? Something like this. Whether in epic, lyric, or tragedy, a god must always be represented as he is. Indeed, he must. Now, a god is really good, isn't he? And must be described as such. What else? And surely nothing good is harmful, is it? I suppose not. And can what isn't harmful do harm? Never. Or can what does no harm do anything bad? No. And can what does nothing bad be the cause of anything bad? How could it? Moreover, the good is beneficial? Yes. It is the cause of doing well? Yes. The good isn't the cause of all things then, but only of good ones. It isn't the cause of bad ones. I agree entirely. Therefore, since a god is good, he is not, as most people claim, the cause of everything that happens to human beings, but of only a few things. For good things are fewer than bad ones in our lives. He alone is responsible for the good things, but we must find some other cause for the bad ones, not a god. That's very true, and I believe it. Then we won't accept from anyone the foolish mistake Homer makes about the gods when he says, "There are two urns at the threshold of Zeus, one filled with good fates, the other with bad ones." Unquote. And the person to whom he gives a mixture of these, quote, sometimes meets with a bad fate, sometimes with good. Unquote. But the one who receives his fate entirely from the second urn, quote, evil famine drives him over the divine earth. End quote. We won't grant either that Zeus is for us, quote, the distributor of both good and bad. End quote. And as to the breaking of the promised truce by Pandarus, if anyone tells us that it was brought about by Athena and Zeus, or that Themis and Zeus were responsible for strife and contention among the gods, we will not praise him, nor will we allow the young to hear the words of Aeschylus, quote, a god makes mortals guilty when he wants utterly to destroy a house. End quote. And if anyone composes a poem about the sufferings of Niobe, such as the one in which these lines occur, or about the house of Pelops, or the tale of Troy, or anything else of that kind, we must require him to say that these things are not the work of a god. Or, if they are, then poets must look for the kind of account of them that we are now seeking, and say that the actions of the gods are good and just, and that those they punish are benefited thereby. We won't allow poets to say that the punished are made wretched and that it was a God who made them so. But we will allow them to say that bad people are wretched because they are in need of punishment, and that in paying the penalty they are benefited by the gods. And as for saying that a God who is himself good is the cause of bad things, we'll fight that in every way. And we won't allow anyone to say it in his own city, if it's to be well governed, or anyone to hear it either, whether young or old, whether in prose or verse. These stories are not pious, not advantageous to us, and not consistent with one another. I like your law, and I'll vote for it. This, then, is one of the laws or patterns concerning the gods to which speakers and poets must conform, namely, that a god isn't the cause of all things, but only of good ones. And it's a fully satisfactory law. What about this second law? Do you think that a god is a sorcerer, able to appear in different forms at different times, sometimes changing himself from his own form into many shapes, sometimes deceiving us by making us think that he has done it? Or do you think he's simple, and least of all likely to step out of his own form? I can't say offhand. Well, what about this? If he steps out of his own form, mustn't he either change himself or be changed by something else? He must. But the best things are least liable to alteration or change, aren't they? For example, isn't the healthiest and strongest body least changed by food, drink, and labor, or the healthiest and strongest plant by sun, wind, and the like? Of course. And the most courageous and most rational soul is least disturbed or altered by any outside affection. Yes. And the same account is true of all artifacts, furniture, houses, and clothes. The ones that are good and well made are least altered by time or anything else that happens to them. That's right. Whatever is in good condition, then, whether by nature or craft or both, admits least of being changed by anything else. So it seems. Now, surely a god and what belongs to him are in every way in the best condition. How could they fail to be? Then a god would be least likely to have many shapes. Indeed. Then does he change or alter himself? Clearly he does not, if indeed he is altered at all. Would he change himself into something better and more beautiful than himself, or something worse and uglier? It would have to be into something worse if he's changed at all, for surely we won't say that a god is deficient in either beauty or virtue. Absolutely right. And do you think, Adeimantus, that anyone, whether god or human, would deliberately make himself worse in any way? No, that's impossible. Is it impossible, then, for gods to want to alter themselves? Since they are the most beautiful and best possible, it seems that each always and unconditionally retains his own shape. That seems entirely necessary to me. Then let no poet tell us about Proteus or Thetis, or say that, quote, the gods, in the likeness of strangers from foreign lands, adopt every sort of shape and visit our cities, end quote. Nor must they present Hera, in their tragedies or other poems, as a priestess collecting alms for, quote, the life-giving sons of the Argive river Inachus, end quote. Or tell us other stories of that sort. Nor must mothers, believing bad stories about the gods wandering at night in the shapes of strangers from foreign lands, terrify their children with them. Such stories blaspheme the gods and, at the same time, make children more cowardly. They mustn't be told. But though the gods are unable to change, do they nonetheless make us believe that they appear in all sorts of ways, deceiving us through sorcery? Perhaps. What? Would a god be willing to be false, either in word or deed, by presenting an illusion? I don't know. Don't you know that a true falsehood, if one may call it that, is hated by all gods and humans? What do you mean? I mean that no one is willing to tell falsehoods to the most important part of himself about the most important things, but of all places he is most afraid to have falsehood there. I still don't understand. That's because you think I'm saying something deep. I simply mean that to be false to one's soul about the things that are, to be ignorant, and to have and hold falsehood there, is what everyone would least of all accept. For everyone hates a falsehood in that place most of all. That's right. Surely, as I said just now, this would be most correctly called true falsehood. Ignorance in the soul of someone who has been told a falsehood. Falsehood in words is a kind of imitation of this affection in the soul, an image of it that comes into being after it, and is not a pure falsehood. Isn't that so? Certainly. And the thing that is really a falsehood is hated not only by the gods, but by human beings as well. It seems so to me. What about falsehood in words? When and to whom is it useful, and so not deserving of hatred? Isn't it useful against one's enemies? And when any of our so-called friends are attempting, through madness or ignorance, to do something bad, isn't it a useful drug for preventing them? It is also useful in the case of those stories we were just talking about, the ones we tell because we don't know the truth about those ancient events involving the gods. By making a falsehood as much like the truth as we can, don't we also make it useful? We certainly do. Then in which of these ways could a falsehood be useful to a god? Would he make false likenesses of ancient events because of his ignorance of them? It would be ridiculous to think that. Then there is nothing of the false poet in a god. Not in my view. Would he be false, then, through fear of his enemies? Far from it. Because of the ignorance or madness of his family or friends, then? No one who is ignorant or mad is a friend of the gods. Then there's no reason for a god to speak falsely. None. Therefore, the daimonic and the divine are in every way free from falsehood. Completely. A god, then, is simple and true in word and deed. He doesn't change himself or deceive others by images, words, or signs, whether in visions or in dreams. That's what I thought as soon as I heard you say it. You agree, then, that this is our second pattern for speaking or composing poems about the gods. They are not sorcerers who change themselves, nor do they mislead us by falsehoods in words or deeds. I agree. So, even though we praise many things in Homer, we won't approve of the dream Zeus sent to Agamemnon, nor of Aeschylus when he makes Thetis say that Apollo sang in prophecy at her wedding, quote, "About the good fortune my children would have, free of disease throughout their long lives, and of all the blessings that the friendship of the gods would bring me. I hoped that Phoebus' divine mouth would be free of falsehood, endowed as it is with the craft of prophecy. But the very god who sang, the one at the feast, the one who said all this, he himself it is who killed my son." End quote. Whenever anyone says such things about a god, we'll be angry with him, refuse him a chorus, and not allow his poetry to be used in the education of the young, so that our guardians will be as God-fearing and God-like as human beings can be. I completely endorse these patterns, he said, and I would enact them as laws. 'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.